Okay. I need to make that. Hello everyone online. Hello Tenpa. Hello everyone in the Gompa. Thank you for joining us for this continuation of the Four Immeasurables. We're very lucky to have Tenpa with us. Thank you again, Tenpa, for joining us. I won't say much, but today is on joy, which is brilliant. And we've really enjoyed having you for the series, and we look forward to you continuing today. Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable. And thank you all for coming, either in person or online, and of course a deep bow of gratitude to all who are joining this course by means of a recording. And that means that it's continuously bringing some benefit to beings, and of course through no virtue of mine, because as I always say, I can only deliver this material if I imagine myself to be the worst student in class who was tasked with making presentation, which I did. You're going to see some slides, probably full of misprints and so forth. So that's all on me. And the goodness of the material itself belongs to the great practitioners of this tradition who have been practicing the Four Immeasurables for many centuries. In particular, this practice is at least 2,600 years old, potentially much older, because although it was very clearly taught and explained by the historical Buddha, there are similar presentations, even though more abbreviate ones, in the yogic tradition, which we now primarily associate with Hinduism. And beyond that, there are, of course, numerous teachings on love, compassion, kindness, the golden rule, and so forth, all across the world, across multiple cultural traditions, civilizations, and so on. So we're really tapping into something that is very deeply present within us. That's the working hypothesis. We have within us these beautiful seeds of kindness, and that kindness can manifest in different forms. In particular, 4 forms are especially important for our mental cultivation, for our mental hygiene, for cultivating a profound sense of well-being, or for experiencing genuine flourishing, which is another way of putting it. It is the working hypothesis of Buddhism in general that in order to experience genuine flourishing, genuine happiness, genuine well-being, or sukha, sat sukha, genuine happiness, we need to work on alleviating certain negative mental qualities, negative mental patterns, and we need to strengthen or uncover some of the positive qualities that are present within us. And there are different ways of going about it, but basically, in most traditions, in most approaches, we would be invited to first establish a certain degree of mental stability, mental composure, mental gatheredness, and then on the basis of that, we would embark on the path of cultivating 2 primary elements, the element of kindness and the element of wisdom. And they are, of course, deeply interrelated, because wisdom here would primarily refer to wisdom that understands different types of interdependence, and therefore absence of independence. This wisdom, when it manifests in the affective realm of emotions, feelings, desires, and aspirations, manifests as love, kindness, compassion, empathy, care, and so forth, because we are so deeply now convinced that we are all interconnected that it is naturally important for us to be kind, and therefore we become kind and we act with kindness and with compassion and so forth. But at the same time, that kindness is then informed once again by wisdom, because wisdom, or this exceptional level of common sense, which is how Sylvia Boorstein likes to define wisdom, and I like to quote that, this exceptional level of common sense that we have cultivated is guiding us in acting with kindness wisely. So knowing what to do in order to truly benefit beings, as opposed to simply following the wish to do good, but not knowing how to do that skillfully, so that the entire system of interdependence to which we belong and of which we are a part can be changed for the better. But before we are invited to truly cultivate wisdom and compassion, usually there are preliminary steps associated with organizing the overall framework of our practice. A part of that is organizing the ethical framework of our training, because in Buddha's on methodology for cultivating genuine flourishing, the first element is not meditation, It's not study. It's not philosophical study for sure. It's not an exploration of the great treatises and so on, even though those elements do become incredibly important later on. The first element there is the practice of basically non-harmful way of life, the practice of non-violence, which for most Buddhist practitioner manifests as a commitment to 5 foundational ethical principles. 5 foundational ethical principles that inspire us to, as much as possible, avoid killing and harming the bodies of others, as much as possible avoid stealing or taking what's not freely given, as much as possible avoid lying, and by extension also using our speech in other unskillful ways, as much as possible avoid using our sexuality in a harmful way, and therefore using it wisely, skillfully, with compassion, with kindness, and so forth, with empathy. And finally, as much as possible, keeping our mind free from intoxication, which of course can be understood in very elaborate and profound ways, or can boil down to simply trying to avoid the most common intoxicants familiar to us in the modern culture. So these 5 principles, when we commit ourselves to them, bring a certain type of joy, which we will look at today as well, that then helps us meditate with a state of relative calmness and serenity, because our conscience is clear, and therefore we feel relatively at ease when we try to then focus on our mind, we try to cultivate loving kindness and all these other sorts of things. But of course, by extension, when we are practicing loving kindness and so forth, that still reinforces the practice of ethics. And so once again, it's yet another self-turning will, self-reinforcing will, where greater and greater degrees of ethical well-being are experienced. But another type of preparation which we need to undertake now before going into the discussion of joy is the preparation with regards to finding a stable and settled state for then embarking upon the journey of the actual practice. And in some traditions, including the tradition of the great yogi Padmasambhava, whose statue was just brought to Jamyang recently, there is a specific exercise that we can do to relax our body, speech, and mind in a profound way, and then do the actual meditation, whatever meditation we might want to do. So we're going to do that exercise, and one of the ways of naming it that is not uncommon is settling our body, speech, and mind in their natural states. It's that beautiful Tibetan concept of rangpap, or settling naturally, settling where it is, settling in its own state. So the invitation there is just to look at our body, our speech, and our mind once we have assumed a comfortable stationary position, and then to undertake that conscious act of settling down, releasing, relaxing, unwinding, not to fall asleep, even though that exercise can also be used for that purpose, but to deactivate temporarily the neurotic patterns associated with our physical behavior, with our verbal behavior, and with our mental behavior, to the degree that would then allow us to practice anything else that we might want to do. And so it is sometimes that we release all types of physical movement for the time being. We release all acts of speech, except, of course, for the act of me guiding the meditation, which we kind of have to use just as a technical means to support our practice temporarily while we're together. And then even releasing all the deliberate mental activity, in that we are not simply trying to not focus on the negative thoughts that are arising, trying to not fuel them for the time being. We're not even focused on the neutral or relatively positive thoughts, in that we are just settling right where we are in the immediacy of the present moment, and allowing the luminosity of our awareness to become more obvious. And then we shape that into the forms associated with specific practices. So we're going to undertake this very simple practice, which is not at all easy to do, because it entails just releasing and resting. And yet, to do it, we can assume we will still do it. And so we can assume a comfortable stationary position. And if you are practicing at home, either on Zoom or by means of a recording, by all means, feel free to use the supine position for this practice, lying flat on your back in the Shavasana posture, or the upright position in which you're sitting comfortably. And if you're sitting on a chair, your feet can be flat on the ground with ankles uncrossed. And if you're on the floor or on a cushion, any position in which your legs are comfortably crossed would do. Of course, some people are capable of doing the full lotus position, or the Vajra position, it's called in the Tibetan lineage. But anything more simple would also do as well. And once we have assumed the position, we can make the choice on whether we want to keep our eyes open or partially hooded, allowing for some light to come in, or closed. All three options are appropriate for this specific type of practice. And then our next step is to bring our awareness to the body and to the sensations of the body. One way to do that is to literally allow our awareness to descend into the depths of the body from the level of our head, so that we're not looking at sensations from above, but we are experiencing them right where they are. Noticing the contact between our body and the ground, the firmness and the stability of the earth element underneath us. And allowing the parts of the body that are touching the ground, whether that's just our feet and buttocks, or our legs in general, or the entire backside of our body, to start releasing muscle tension. And so releasing all the tension that we can release from our feet and toes, from our legs in general, spending some time with our pelvic floor to release all the unnecessary tension there. And then joyfully exploring the sensations in our abdominal area and in the lower back. Then our chest. Simply observing the sensations and releasing tension when we notice some. The same with our shoulders, releasing tension, noticing the sensations. And then we'll allow our awareness to move down the arms towards the elbow, releasing all the tension from our hands and fingers, and establishing a profound sense of stillness there. Then coming back to our shoulders and exploring the sensations in our neck and throat. The back of our head. Our crown. And our facial muscles. And then with that, extending our awareness to the entirety of the body to notice its experiences and the process of natural, uncontrived breathing. Natural because we're not trying to hold the breath, to force the breath, to change the pace or the volume. Instead, allowing the body itself to choose the optimal rhythm and to soothe all the systems of the body itself and of our mind with that natural rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. Noticing the sensations across this tactile field, and through that arriving at greater and greater degrees of relaxation, stillness that does not require us to be tense, and vigilance, being energized enough to not fall asleep, to keep practicing. Our speech is resting in effortless silence. We're not saying anything, not reciting anything even. And our mind, because it is focused on this tactile field, is also experiencing greater and greater degrees of relaxation, stability with regards to this object, and clarity. Because through observation, we're cultivating our ability to see clearly. And so, deepening, strengthening this fusion of relaxation, stillness and vigilance, relaxation, stability and clarity is the way to move towards greater degrees of settling in this natural state. But for some masters, that's not enough. There needs to be another type of settling. And that would be us settling down in a positive motivation. So with our body resting, with our breath moving freely, we can take a few moments to think of our highest spiritual or psychological aspirations. The highest, most daring goals we might have with regards to our psychological evolution or our spiritual evolution. And having brought those to mind, we orient our practice and the entirety of the time we're spending together towards that goal. Literally breathing life into this aspiration with each new out-breath. May all the practices of joy that I will undertake along with listening, contemplating, asking questions, and so forth, may all of that contribute to the greatest possible well-being for myself, but also for all who live. Genuine flourishing, genuine well-being for all. And having established that, we come back to the body, noticing its sensations and experiences right now, its position, its level of tension, the presence of any types of discomfort, and so on. And then we very gently introduce a tiny bit of movement by rocking back and forth or moving our fingers, activating our facial muscles to perhaps smile. And then we slowly transition out of this practice to rejoin our shared space. So, once again, thank you for coming. It's a great joy to see all of you here, or to think of everyone joining us online, and potentially of some people watching this as a recording. And that in itself, of course, the joy that I'm experiencing right now is one of the multiple types of joy that are available to us, and that's the joy of at least thinking that I'm doing something meaningful by talking about these things. So I'll just enjoy that for the time being. But also the joy of being in a community, and specifically the joy of being in a community that is focused on something that is wholesome, beneficial, productive, healing potentially for the world and for all the systems and communities to which we individually belong. And that healing element that we will hopefully introduce to ourselves and to others, and that we have been working throughout this course on the Four Immeasurables, comes from the Buddha's insights into the nature and the functioning of our mind. So just as a basic introduction to that, and of course most people here would be familiar with that way more than I am, way better than I am, we are dealing with a psychological system that was academically formulated about 1800 years ago and practically formulated 2600 years ago. So if you're familiar with the history of Western sciences, you know that Western psychology as we know it is roughly 150 years old when it comes to the academic side of it, because we have such figures as Freud and Jung and William James and others who, most of them men, initially because women were denied access to education, formulated these insights as they thought about the mind and how it works. And of course, as we know, some of those insights initially were a bit depressing when it comes to the view of human potential and human possibilities that was espoused by Freud, for example. But then a little bit more optimism started creeping in, and now we have such psychological schools of thought as transpersonal psychology, as positive psychology, and other let's say, movements in the psychological world that are trying to explore not simply the issue of bringing us back to a state of normalcy by helping us overcome or mitigate some of the negative effects associated with our ADHD and OCD and all these other problems that we might have, endless combination of numbers, letters, and so forth. Not simply that, but exploring the question of how to allow us to experience a genuine state of profound, lasting, meaningful well-being that would be validly called human flourishing. How do we uncover that amazing potential? So positive psychology, as developed by Martin Seligman and Barbara Fredrickson and many others, transpersonal psychology, some other movements within that world are exploring those questions, and that's where there's a lot, of course, of beauty in the interplay or in the dialogue or in the exchange between different branches of science, including psychology and neuroscience and cognitive sciences in general as a combined field of or intersection of different fields of study, all of that, interacting with each other, exploring all of it, talking also to quantum physics and trying to see how it all works and how does the consciousness construct reality. All of that very, very interesting and fascinating. And on the other side of things, Buddhism, which is actively engaged in the dialogue with modern science, primarily through the initiatives undertaken by the Mind and Life Institute under the auspices of Mind and Life conferences that are happening every year, sometimes twice a year. And within all of that, of course, we are learning more and more about human potential and human beauty and how to cultivate and nourish beautiful human qualities in education, through culture, through mental training, through meditation, in mental care facilities, and so forth, all across the globe. But one thing that is not uncommon in these dialogues is the assumption on our side that what do these Buddhist people know about psychology, really, right? Because psychology is Jung, is Freud, is William James, is Martin Seligman, is Paul Ekman, is all these brilliant people, whereas Buddhists know a lot about incense and men wearing skirts and beautiful images in temples and golden statues and closing their eyes and looking at their navel and maybe working with their chakras, whatever that is. So kind of the association there is, let's say, religion, whatever that means. They're probably praying to someone. Probably this Buddha person is a god that they're praying to. It's just he's kind of a fatter god than some of the other gods, and he's kind of shining, but he looks peaceful, so there must be something there. And yet, if we then look at Buddhism the way Buddhism sees itself, we arrive at a very different picture in which, although Buddhism does have all the salient features of being a religion, in that there are temples and incense and prayers and mantras and prayer beads and indeed monastics who are men wearing skirts, all of that does exist. Buddhism primarily is proud of its philosophy and of its psychology, two very important branches of Buddhist knowledge. Buddhist philosophy is that which explains or tries to explain how does reality exist. And that can be more cosmological, and Buddhism has a very elaborate view of the multiverse, with multiple universes coexisting in the same time, but out of sync with each other, in that some universes are rising, some are collapsing, some are going through the Big Bang, some are going through the Big Crunch at the same time, all over the place, in a very fascinating manner that goes way beyond what the Marvel multiverse can depict as possible. And Buddhist psychology is what explains how the mind that cognizes this reality works and operates. So within that description, there is a very, very technical explanation of how our mind has different functions, different mental factors, as they're called, that correspond to different mental states that we experience. So there is a specific mental function for being angry, and when we're angry, that's activated. There is a specific mental function for being desirous of something. Ooh, I want that lemon cheesecake. There's a specific mental function for loving someone. And of course, there's different types of love. So there are actually many mental factors that we in the West would call love, but they're quite different from each other, because loving kindness and desirous erotic love are not at all the same thing, even though they are often combined in the same mental state or present within our attitude towards someone. And other mental factors that are merely technical in nature, such as concentration, mindfulness, intention, and so forth. So within all of that, within that big soup of different mental functions, the Buddha and the subsequent masters are inviting us to identify the states of mind that would contribute to a lasting sense of well-being, states of mind that are making us miserable, unhappy, and also that are driving us to harm others and the world and to destroy the planet, yada, yada, yada. And the states of mind that are neutral but can be used for good. And from a Buddhist point of view, even such neutral mental function as sleep can be transformed into something extremely virtuous if we master the technical arts very, very very, very complex arts of, for example, lucid dreaming and dream yoga. There are specific explanations on how to use those to harness the energy of our sleep and use it for something good. So lots of psychological knowledge there. And amidst those positive mental factors, some are different types of kindness. And then it is said that, well, if you truly do want to flourish, it would not be enough to simply cultivate kindness, because we also do need the wisdom side and the technical side of concentration and so forth. But kindness is kind of quintessential, and that's especially strongly emphasized in the tradition of so-called Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle, which is the form of Buddhism that is practiced in the Tibetan cultural region, which also includes Bhutan and parts of Nepal and northern regions of India and the 3 Buddhist republics within Russia and so forth there, but also across the Chinese-speaking world, in Vietnam, in Korea, and Japan. So all of these countries, all of those regions have historically attached great, great, great importance to the cultivation of these types of kindness to the ultimate level where they become an absolutely unimaginable state of altruism fused with wisdom that then allows us to fully break through all the barriers that hide our deepest beauty, so that through arriving at that deepest beauty, we can then infinitely benefit all beings. So that's the overall plot there. We're cultivating, within the traditional context, these to arrive at the full uncovering of our potential. And because our potential, our deepest nature, is infinitely and inherently beautiful, it is radiant, spacious, luminous emptiness, which means spaciousness in that regard when we're talking about basic goodness. Absence of any boundaries and that would be limiting our potential, absence of anything that would make us inherently limited, corrupted, damaged, sinful, and so forth. When we arrive at that, of course, we experience infinite happiness, and we can bring infinite happiness to others. So, wow, sounds good. But in this day and age, many people arrive at these practices not with that lofty goal in mind, but simply to use them to transform the ordinary experiences in the here and now. And because we know more and more and more about the effect that these practices have on our health, on our genetic makeup, on our physical health, on our mental health, on our ability to overcome addictions and so forth, that's another totally valid use for these methods of meditation. The therapeutic use, we could say. We use them to fix the mental problems that we have to a certain degree, and then we use them to experience greater pleasure in living and being alive. So we use them to not kill ourselves, and then we use them to actually enjoy life, which is not a small feat at all. Anything that helps us not kill ourselves, anything that helps us become healthier as people who can also bring healing to this world, wow, super powerful. But beyond that, it's good to keep in mind there are these more advanced goals. And when we're doing these practices, they're actually allowing us to get glimpses of that more profound nature that we have. And that one day might inspire us, even if we are starting at a therapeutic level, that one day might inspire us to pursue those higher goals. And actually, there will be a natural activation of our passion towards that in the long run. But we start where we are. So whatever our personal goal is for being here, it's valid. Some of them might be more in tune with what we see as being Buddhist is all about. But we are where we are, and we arrive at this practice at our current level of psychological well-being. And in the preceding meetings, we have had 8 so far, so 2 sections of 1 month each. We looked at the practices of loving kindness, or love, which is the wish for all beings to be happy and have the causes of happiness, and the practice of compassion, which is defined in the Buddhist tradition, in Buddhist psychological tradition, as the wish for beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So we meditate on those very powerfully, and then we see how much they change the fabric of our mind and how they affect our behavior, and how they also allow us to develop concentration, because these practices, especially the first 3, including joy, which we're going to be talking about today, empathetic joy. These practices have been introduced first by the Buddha and then by the subsequent masters as ways of training our attention. So even if your goal for being here is just to cultivate single-pointed attention to be very productive at your job, totally doable through applying these practices. Because some people don't like the mushy stuff, as they call it. It's like, oh, being kind, loving kindness, that's not what real men do, okay. But then you can cultivate laser-like concentration through loving kindness as well, if that's what, turns you on, that idea. But in addition to that, and that's the beauty of these methods, while allowing us to cultivate laser-like concentration if we invest in many hundreds of hours into that, honestly, thousands of hours, while doing that, they do make our heart soft and receptive and sensitive in the most beautiful way possible. They also make it extremely resilient. Because, for example, when we were looking at compassion, we saw that compassion, as this very specific mental state, is an antidote to the opposing mental state of cruelty, which is the wish to harm others, to inflict pain. Obviously, compassion, opposite of cruelty, kind of logical. Even in our cultural tradition, that's understandable. But it's also the antidote for sorrow, for looking at the woes of the world or the suffering of the world and feeling, oh no, that's too horrible, and giving up internally. Compassion is the antidote for that. And therefore, although we do use the term compassion fatigue, what gets fatigued is not compassion proper, is not the purified, refined version of compassion that we can cultivate, but the facsimiles of that are initially available to us and that are therefore vulnerable and limited and that do get fatigued or burnt out. So kind of fascinating how it all works. And the same system applies to joy. We will look at the two opposites of joy, of empathetic joy, that can be alleviated by doing these practices. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So some of this slide and the next slide are some of the reading materials, and we also have a resource page for this course, which everyone is welcome to use. The link is on the registration page for the course itself, and then for the subsequent meetings, I usually carry a QR code that you can scan with your phone, and it will give you access to all the recordings from the previous meetings, but also access to guided meditations that we'll be doing as we're going through the joy cycle and then the equanimity cycle next month. But one of the main books that I recommend is this book by Dr. Alan Wallace, For Immeasurables, Practices to Open the Heart. There's also an audio version of that narrated by my colleague Vanessa. And that's a book that covers the approach to these four types of kindness, both from the side of the Pali tradition of Buddhist practice and study and the Sanskrit tradition. So both are explained in this book quite nicely. It also covers the topics of concentration and ethical practice and wisdom and so forth. So it gives you the full presentation of what we're going to be doing here, even though the chapter on joy is quite short in that book. So this is where we can actually flesh it out together in this course. And then the next one is these two books that you can actually purchase from the reception here. Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Venerable Thupten Chodron, and another book, In Praise of Great Compassion. This one is more of a reference source for all things Pali and Sanskrit. So it compares different quintessential points related to Buddhism as they're seen in the Pali tradition, in the Tibetan branch of the Sanskrit tradition, and in the Chinese branch of the Sanskrit tradition. And this book is part of a very large cycle called The Library of Wisdom and Compassion, which is a multi-volume presentation of all the things that are essential for knowing Buddhism and practicing Buddhism successfully. And this specific volume is volume number 5, and it goes into great depth with regards to compassion practices, love practices, joy practices, equanimity practices, and then combining them all into a very powerful mental state, which we can describe as altruism, but which in Buddhism in particular goes beyond simply altruism into something very special called bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. So all these psychological techniques and types of training are, as you can see, described in great detail here, very small letters, lots of material, lots to read. But the chapter on the Four Immeasurables is quite large and quite beautiful, so there's one copy of this at the reception and multiple copies of Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions, if you are into the Buddhist stuff, into the Buddhist side of things. Next slide, please. So these are some of the reference sources. So this next slide is an introduction to some of the types of joy that we can actually arrive at through contemplative practice within the Buddhist tradition, obviously, because I'm not going to be talking about, oh, these are the 70 types of joy that the Sufi tradition allows you to cultivate, or the Christian mystical tradition, simply because, well, our time is limited, and also I'm not an expert on most of these other traditions, whereas with Buddhism, as a Buddhist translator or interpreter, more or less I have some familiarity, even though it's very limited. And so there are many pleasurable experiences that arise in the mind when we cultivate our inner resources. And these pleasurable experiences are called in English joy. So there are actually many different Sanskrit and Pali and Tibetan terms that can be translated as joy, as happiness, as bliss, as ecstasy, as rapture, and of course there are more as comfort, and there are more synonyms, or roughly synonyms, that we can find. But basically we're talking about mental states that are associated in our culture with feeling good. So some of the types of feeling good that we can arrive at through practicing these meditation techniques in an orderly fashion start with hedonic joy. So hedonic joy is the joy that's triggered by our contact with the outside world, something in the outside world. And this is where Buddhism specifically talks about 4 types of hedonic joy that are most addictive to us. We receive joy from coming in contact with pleasurable sensory stimuli. So pleasant visual objects, like a nice flower or someone's pretty face. Pleasant sounds, nice music. Pleasant smells, pleasant tastes, and pleasant tactile sensations, all the way up to the most intense type of tactile pleasure associated with sexual union. These are collectively sensory pleasures. So, of course, there is the joy of, enjoying a good cup of coffee. There is the joy of listening to divine music. There is the joy of looking at the majestic mountains or beautiful vistas and so forth. Absolutely, that's valid, and nowhere is it said that you're not allowed to have a good cup of coffee if you're practicing Buddhism. On the contrary, what makes it contemplative? Because everyone can enjoy a nice cup of coffee, right? What makes it contemplative? Well, the fact that we can bring such mental states as mindful awareness, appreciation, contentment, and so forth to these experiences. So in some secular modalities for teaching mindfulness, as well as in the Buddhist approach, for example, of Master Thich Nhat Hanh's community, you would find a lot of practices for truly enjoying your cup of tea in a very mindful and focused manner, and with a lot of contentment. And that is used as a contemplative practice. So truly taking each sip of your hot beverage with mindful appreciation of all the interdependence that went into it, and also with mindful awareness towards the taste and the smell and so forth. You would have practices like that which teaches very powerfully in a contemplative way, and that's breaking away from our original greed towards such objects, to appreciate each small moment of joy so that we don't become incredibly greedy towards infinite amounts of consumption, which happens, of course, to many people on this planet, and can happen to any one of us, in that we can be so unable to be satisfied and content with anything we're consuming that we need to consume more and more and more. And it's not enough for me to have 3 billion, I need to have 33 billion, and then 300 billion, and it goes on and on and on, and there's no end. On the contrary, enjoy that cup of tea with all the mindful awareness and wisdom and compassion that you can muster, and then you're no longer so greedy because you're able to enjoy this more. So that is absolutely a contemplative way of enjoying these simple aspects of reality. And once again, Master Thich Nhat Hanh has many beautiful teachings on it. He has these beautiful pocket books that his students are now compiling on how to sit, how to walk, how to argue, how to love, how to eat, So how to eat would probably be the most appropriate for this type of joy. And then, so that's the first type of pleasure associated with sensory delights. But then you have the pleasure of possessing something. So just knowing that you own this beautiful thing, or that you have that much money in your bank account, or that you have a car, a house, anything else that you might possess. And just knowing, oh, well, it is nice to be a house owner. I'm not a house owner myself, so I imagine it must feel nice to, have a place that you can call your home and to have it legally be yours. But it's also nice to, have nice stuff. I have these Naruto pants, as I call them, ordered from, a Chinese vendor many years ago. And to this day, people sometimes say, oh, they're kind of nice. Of course, many people are horrified by them, but as probably most of you are. But there are people in this world who think they're cool. So I'm like, okay, nice, yeah, well, they're at least comfortable and nice to walk around. And even that might be a little source of pleasure and joy. So how do I make it more contemplative? By appreciating with wisdom, with my factor of wisdom, exceptional level of common sense, right? Appreciating that this is a specific configuration of material energy that is serving its purpose and protecting my legs from being seen by all of you, and protecting me from the outer elements and, many other functions that the pens have. There are pockets here that I can put stuff in, and all of that. Specific configuration of material energy, another configuration of material energy called money went into buying this. I own it now. I can use it. I can use it for the benefit of all beings by protecting them once again from this horrible side that is underneath. So, well, why not appreciate it? That's more contemplative now. That's not simply me wanting to buy 70 pairs of sneakers, but then just keeping them somewhere with no use, with no appreciation, with no wisdom, with no compassion embedded into that process. So then the other two are praise and reputation. So receiving joy and pleasure from being praised, and receiving joy and pleasure from having a good reputation. So those are also types of joy. And once again, we can add the contemplative element to that joy by hearing praise with a sense of delight in the ability of others to see good qualities. That's what Shantideva, the great Buddhist poet and contemplative, is inviting us to do. When others are praising us, instead of thinking, oh, well, yes, I am indeed the hottest thing on earth, we can think, oh, bless you. You have an ability to see something good. Not me as good, but the good qualities that came forth from my basic goodness, from somewhere deep within me. Wow, that's beautiful. It's how wonderful. How wonderful that people possess the ability to be grateful, to appreciate, to thank each other. That's truly powerful. So once again, a contemplative element there. And with our reputation, seeing it as a resource that we can use for something good rather than an end goal in itself makes it more contemplative as well. And we can indeed enjoy those things. And there are practices for that, including in one of the approaches that I sometimes am invited to teach, the Cultivating Emotional Balance approach, which arose as a result of one of those Mind and Life conferences. It's an approach. It's a method for harnessing the energy of our emotions and learning about them. In that approach, there is a practice called harvesting joy, and that's simply sitting with our senses open and seeing where do pleasant feelings arise towards this sound, towards that smell, towards that tactile experience, towards this color that I'm seeing or shape. And spending like a bee some moments with each one of these experiences to truly experience contentment and pleasure there. And then like a bee flying to the next one. And then flying to the next one. And that can be very, very powerfully nourishing if we are feeling hedonically starved, which can happen. If we're seeing ourselves as contemplatives, or if we are limited in our resources for whatever reason. We can still harvest joy even if we are limited in terms of our ability to purchase stuff. That's the reality, and that is something that comes naturally to some cultures in this world, and is more difficult for some other cultures. So there are cultures where people are able to just sit in the sun, enjoy that one cup of espresso or that one teeny tiny tea, or masala chai and so forth, and just luxuriate in that act of sitting in the sun and having that. And then there are cultures who do not inherently possess that talent, or that talent is not encouraged, and therefore there is an incredible, first of all, jealousy towards those who can, and then greed towards something bigger that would satisfy this inner hunger for pleasure. So it's very, very good to cultivate that and to also teach that to children, yada, yada, yada. So that's the first type of joy. But then the next one, the next three come from the three quintessential elements on the path that the Buddha described in his methodology for becoming happy. His methodology for becoming happy includes three main elements: ethics, mental gatheredness, and wisdom. So ethical practice, or having an ethical practice, is a conscious thing that we undertake by deciding, oh, these are the ethical values that they have. This is how I'm going to practice them. Then every day reminding ourselves, today I will focus on doing this and that and on avoiding this and that. So that's the idea behind Buddhist practice of ethics. It's not simply about someone saying, do not kill, or you'll go to hell, or something like that, or just saying, no, do not kill, and that's us being like, okay, I'm not going to kill, yay, that's it. No, it's an elaborate system of psychological training in which we strengthen specific mental functions and factors associated with ethical behavior to recalibrate our mind. And then that also manifests in terms of our actual behavior. But because we're doing this act of recalibrating our mental network, of our intermingling of mental factors and functions and mental energies and so forth, that intermingling, that calibration leads to this second type of joy, called in the Pali tradition sometimes the joy of blamelessness. So the pleasure of having a clear conscience. How is that experienced? It's not a pleasure that says, oh, I've never done anything wrong, because obviously no one is like that. We've all made mistakes in the past, and we're making mistakes daily, at least at the level of intent versus impact. We meant well, but we said a stupid thing. We meant well, but we said a culturally insensitive thing. We harm through simply our act of breathing, because there's minute beings all around us and within our bodies and so forth. So inevitably some harm comes, but that joy of blamelessness arising through knowing that we truly have committed ourselves to decreasing that harm, and also to increasing the benefit that we bring to others, and also to cultivating the resources of our heart and mind. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama has a beautiful book called Beyond Religion, and it's his kind of textbook on secular ethics, where he describes in great detail these types of mental recalibration that need to happen with regards to all the different aspects of our mind and our behavior, so that that joy of blamelessness can be experienced to a greater degree. And that joy of blamelessness will superpower our meditation, amongst other things. And also, it will guarantee us a peaceful death, because we will know towards the end of our life that we've really done our best. We really lived a good, ethical, high-quality life. We were a kind, genuinely nice, not nice in terms of pleasing others, but nice in terms of being aligned with empathy, compassion, care, and so forth, human being. That's beautiful. That's very, very powerful, a very powerful way to live. But then beyond that, the Buddha says, we can cultivate much more profound states of bliss when we cultivate, on the basis of ethical practice, mental gatheredness or concentration, samadhi. So samadhi is one of these Sanskrit terms that are slightly difficult to translate, and that's why there's some beauty in studying them. Samadhi means gathering of our mental energy into a coherent whole and purifying, refining it. And in particular, it is described in, and you would also see it in the book on the Four Immeasurables that I've mentioned. We are purifying it from the 5 obscuring factors that kind of make it all messed up and tangly and convoluted and problematic and shaky and murky and all of that, so that our mind becomes like clear water, becomes translucent, transparent. It can see things clearly. It is not disturbed. So instead of being a messy soup that is also not appetizing at all, it becomes like a beautiful clear lake that is completely still. That's the result of samadhi practice. And there are actual metaphors used by, or analogies used by the Buddha to describe how the mind can be compared to water, how these 5 disturbing factors are like different problems in that water, and how removing them through their opposites is bringing us that state of profound peace and clarity. So the degree to which we will progress along that path of attentional training, concentration training, and we don't necessarily have to reach the deepest states of it, but even a tiny step towards that goal would already increase our well-being, and to realize awakening, we will need quite profound levels of it. But even a tiny step towards that would strengthen 2 specific types of joy that are described, of bliss or rapture, or pleasure, that are described in this context. And in Sanskrit, they're called priti and sukha. Zest and happiness is the translation choice that Dr. Wallace follows in the books on the Four Immeasurables. There are other ways of translating it, but they can be compared to actual pleasure that we derive from meditation, and to lightness of being that emerges out of being a meditator. So the first one to emerge is just us starting to really enjoy each meditation session, which does not happen in the beginning. For some people it does, but it's more of excitement about, oh, how cool, I'm a meditator now, something like that. Whereas the happiness that would start emerging through practice will be more of actual, subtle, physical and mental bliss that comes up in each meditation session, or in some meditation sessions, and more and more and more. And it will keep growing the more we progress in attentional training. And then the other one is a lightness of being. And physically, people describe it as if the body itself becomes so much lighter to move around. It's like you're no longer bent down by the weight of your emotional baggage, but even physically, there's a certain lightness that arises. And even professional athletes report, if they have undertaken that, and that's anecdotal evidence, but still important or valuable, that it's easier to lift for those who lift weights. Interesting side effect. So that would be probably an interesting thing to explore in the professional athlete world, but it would take quite a lot of hours of training to arrive at that. And yet it's possible. So priti and sukha, zest and happiness that arise, or zest and joy, zest and well-being that arise within concentrational training. And then if we reach very profound states of concentration, there is an incredible level of bliss that's available there. But then for the third element in the Buddha's approach, third element is the cultivation of wisdom, prajna, discerning awareness, discerning intelligence. And within that, there is a type of joy that is also quite commonly known in the Christian tradition of St. Augustine and some others, and that's the joy of knowing the truth. This idea of the truth will set you free and everything else, quite common for most traditions of contemplative practice. So the joy of knowing reality and liberating the mind, that's the bliss that's experienced once mental fetters have fallen off our body and mind. And we do not need to buy into all of this right now. We can just say, well, there are reportedly people who have experienced some of it or all of these. Doesn't have to be me right now, but it can be me. At any point, if I invest the hours, I will either prove that it's right or prove that it's wrong. There's 3 options there. Option number 1, I can conduct these experiments that the Buddha, as a theoretical and experimental physicist, is suggesting for us. Theoretical and experimental psychonaut, in this case, He's saying, you can conduct these experiments and there's 3 possible options. 1, you will conduct the experiment incorrectly, so you will get no results, because you made mistakes in how you were practicing. That's totally possible. That's why we need to rely on valid material, good explanations, good technical presentations, and ideally we would have someone helping us adjust our practice when we have questions or we are making mistakes and so forth. That's the art of learning a craft, or that's how we learn any art, including singing and playing the piano and so forth. Someone has to adjust to make the corrections. So if we do not make the mistakes, then 2 options are left. We will either prove the theory right, or we will disprove the theory. So if he's wrong, we will not be experiencing all these things. And if he's right, we will. Very simple. And the first 3 are relatively easy to accomplish. First one, Well, just practice some mindfulness when you're eating an apricot, and do it consistently, and you will see how much more pleasure you can derive through mindfully consuming hedonic goods. The second one, well, establish a certain ethical practice. Yes, it takes a certain amount of effort, but it's good anyway to live in an ethical way just in terms of our social existence. Oh, okay, doable. And then you will see whether your mind feels lighter at the end of the day, and or at the end of a year of doing that. And then for the third one, well, yes, invest some dozens of hours at least into something as simple as mindfulness of breathing, for example, or loving kindness meditation. And you will see if you do start to experience priti and sukha. And of course, the deeper you go, the more you will experience them. So that's interesting. And then the fourth one will need for us to experience the fourth one, we will need to use a lot of preparation from the previous stages and combine that preparation, that foundation that we've built, with insight-style practices, different types of vipassana insight practice. Because through one of the styles of vipassana, and there are many styles available to us, some more intuitive in nature, some more analytical, some more empirical, many different styles across different traditions, because in some traditions you are invited to solve koans, or to work with one question about the nature of reality, huato, or to investigate the nature of your awareness, or to understand whether the stable has inherent, many approaches, many techniques. But whichever ones you choose, and there's different ways to choose them, you would eventually break through if you apply enough effort and collect all the necessary preconditions, and then you will truly experience this joy of liberating the mind, which, according to those who have experienced it, is, well, the analogy, a simple analogy is always given. Imagine that you've been walking for the last year with something tightly bound around your chest. And you were like, why is it hard to breathe? Why is it hard to breathe? I don't know why it's hard to breathe. And suddenly someone showed you, you can remove this thing, right? And you're like, okay, wow. Whew. Even though that analogy is incomplete, because in actual fact, what it is teaching us is that we believed that there was something that was binding us, and we lived as if we cannot breathe fully. And then someone says, you can actually breathe with your full chest, right? And we're like, oh, I can? Really? And then you discover how much bliss there is in actually being able to breathe freely, as opposed to having for our entire life only taken teeny tiny breaths and then suffered from that. So it's simply an analogy, not the description of the experience itself, but the liberating power of it is kind of along those lines, except more powerful, probably more strong. And then in this tradition, the specific lineage of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, or the branch of Buddhism that is the Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, there are also incredible practices for working with an incredibly intense state of bliss by working either with our subtle nervous system, through which we can induce very elaborate states of joy and bliss that they are called joys, 4 joys, 16 joys, so forth. Incredible levels of bliss that way transcend the bliss of sexual union. And once again, that's just technical approach to working with the body and with the mind. And another approach within that same system, there are types of joy, bliss, and rapture that are available through simply accessing the more profound states of our awareness itself. Not necessarily even through working with our subtle nervous system, even though sometimes that's employed, but sometimes through breaking through into the innermost levels of our awareness directly and seeing that there are already in their nature joyful and blissful. So that exists as well. So that's a collection of 5 primary types of joy that we can access. But the joy that we're looking at today is kind of a subsidiary for all of those. It's a tool that will help us deal with the first 2 more successfully. It will be directly related to the third one because it will allow us to cultivate both zest and happiness. It belongs to the category, this joy belongs to the category of concentration techniques. It will serve as a support for insight practices because once we have experienced this specific joy in meditation, we can turn our searching mind towards it and ask some very pertinent questions about its actual nature or the nature of the mind that's generating it. So then we can gain insight as well. And this joy will also serve as a very directly, this joy is also very directly connected to the deepest types of joy that can be induced through Vajrayana practice as well. So although I'm not qualified or learned enough to comment on that in great detail, there is a very direct connection there. So next slide, please. So this type of joy that we're trying to look at is called empathetic joy, or mudita. Mudita is a term shared by Pali and Sanskrit, because sometimes the terms diverge. For loving kindness, Maitri is the Sanskrit one, and Metta is the Pali one, so a little bit of difference there. But mudita is a common term for both of these languages. And the root there, mud, we will see in another word today, another type of joy that supports this one. But empathetic joy, sympathetic joy, two most common translations for this. Sometimes it's just translated as joy, but although correct, because in Tibetan that's just called gawa, which literally means joy. Although correct, the translation of joy is kind of confusing because, once again, there are many types of love and there are many types of joy, and the joy of eating a good hamburger is not the joy that's described here. So that's not the joy we're cultivating in this meditation. So then empathetic joy and sympathetic joy is a very helpful description of what it is. So it is defined as delighting in the joys or happiness of others, plus the wish for beings to attain a sorrowless state, a state that is devoid of misery and that is joyful, plus the wish for these beings to not be separated from the happiness that they already possess. So this definition is suddenly more elaborate than the definition of loving kindness and compassion, right? Because loving kindness, the wish for someone to be happy and have the causes of happiness. Quite simple. Joy is primarily first in the earliest Buddhist sources on the topic, is defined as more of an attitude of delight towards something than an aspiration. So I will quote from Master Anuruddha, who compiled one of the most commonly quoted Pali sources on different mental functions and factors that exist within our mind. So a classification, once again, of different building blocks from which our mind is built. So he defines appreciative joy as one of the mental factors, and that's not how it's done in the Sanskrit tradition, but still very, very important here, or very valuable here. So he says that mudita, or appreciative joy, has the characteristic of gladness at the success of others. So gladness at the success of others, gladness at the happiness of others, gladness at the joy of others is what mudita is. So that's where it begins textually in terms of different books. You know, we are overviewing texts that were written over about 1,000 years between early Pali sources, including, for example, the Path of Purification, which is a text from roughly 4th, 5th century, all the way up to 14th century Tibetan texts. So about 1,000 years in between. That's what we're trying to integrate into one coherent picture so that we know how to really meditate on all of this stuff in the most elaborate and helpful way possible. How not to limit ourselves too much, but also how to not overextend ourselves, because there are many different teachings on joy here. So we're starting with this definition of delighting in the joys of others, or as Anuruddha here says, the gladness at the success of others. Okay, that's a good beginning. But then, because we're talking here within the parameters of the Indo-Tibetan tradition, we have two big masters who wrote books on the issue, and they were brothers, incidentally, Vasubandhu and Asanga. And they wrote books about, they each wrote a book about different mental functions that we have. But they have two different presentations, largely overlapping, but with some differences. And that's where there is a difference between Vasubandhu and Asanga, specifically with regards to how they interpret joy, empathetic joy. What is this? But we primarily rely on the definitions of Asanga. So within Asanga's presentation, because Vasubandhu simply describes joy as mental happiness. So in his presentation, loving kindness is about physical happiness, joy is about mental happiness, so together they work quite nicely, but that's not what Asanga follows. Asanga follows the logic of loving kindness is the wish for beings to be happy and of the cause of suffering, and joy is this delight about the happiness that they already have, plus perhaps an element of aspiration there, which consists of the wish for them not to lose that good-natured joy, but also to arrive at joy that would be sorrowless, that would be irreversibly good. And within the Buddhist tradition, that of course is understood as first gaining good rebirth, a good type of rebirth, like the one that we have right now. We have the freedom to practice, lots of snacks, lots of motivation to practice because everything around is crashing and burning. So, I better get enlightened soon to contribute something meaningful and also to, not lose my mind amidst this chaos. So gaining a good rebirth and then potentially gaining personal liberation or nirvana, abiding nirvana, and then full awakening or non-abiding nirvana. So may they gain that joy, sorrowless bliss. That's what it means. So primarily gladness with an element of aspiration is the kind of focus that we're going to pursue within the next meetings for our meditations. And there's lots of good textual basis for that, because as we have established, that's what Anuruddha said about gladness, and then this element of wishing for them not to separate from sorrowless bliss and not to be separated from the happiness that they already possess would actually be already familiar to everyone who's attended Tibetan Buddhist classes and has recited the prayer of the Four Immeasurables. Because within that prayer, this third line that corresponds to joy is usually recited as, may they never be separated from the happiness that is free from suffering. I think that's the FBMT translation of it. And then, or from sorrowless bliss, that's the translation that Shavasti Abbey uses. Many other ways of translating it. And in the words of Master Jamyang Wangpo, one of the great masters of the 19th century, it's just, may they never be apart from joy. Okay, so we are delighting in their joy, but we're also saying, may they never be apart from that joy. And that's kind of good-natured already, right? Because it's kind of a double goodness. It's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, because you are getting the gladness, and that's the jelly, but you're also getting some nutritious element out of that aspiration, which in the long term inspires you to also keep contributing to their joy and to more and more refined versions of that joy. Because gladness alone is not particularly motivating us into action that would, transform the world. Yeah, it's all good. Everyone's happy. Cool. But if there is that aspiration, we will also be inspired to contribute somehow. So very, very psychologically profound. And then from Jigme Lingpa, actually more than 1,000 years, I should say, because we're not limiting ourselves to the 14th century. Jigme Lingpa is a relatively recent master, I think 18th century. Jigme Lingpa, one of the great contemplatives of Tibet, associated with the Nyingma tradition, but not limited to it, because he had a very profound effect on all the traditions in a way, or on many traditions, let's say. In his presentation of the Four Immeasurables, says this about joy. Joy is to delight in others' pleasure and success. It is to cultivate the wish that all have happiness. It is a joy one feels when they achieve it for themselves, and is the wish that they should never be deprived of it. So exactly what we said. It's gladness, and the wish that they would never be deprived of it, and the wish that all have happiness. But in this case, the difference between empathetic joy and loving kindness is that loving kindness sees that there's greater happiness possible. We're not yet there, but may we arrive there, so yes, guys, go over there. So it's kind of this gentle pushing from behind. Yes, go towards greater happiness, all of you, including myself. Whereas empathetic joy sees that there's already some element of happiness there, and we're just wishing for it to expand. Joy for us and for all beings to go from joy to joy to joy to joy to greater joy to greatest possible joy. So love, joy, empathetic joy, in terms of us using our attention, has to focus on a certain spark of joy somewhere. So let's look at the next slide. So this is where, when we're focusing attention and when we're listening to guided meditations on this practice, we would actually see two different things combined into one often. And they're different because they're different terms in Tibetan and in Pali and in Sanskrit, but they're often brought into the same practice. And that's even done in this book, In Praise of Great Compassion, to a certain degree. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is also beneficial to tease those apart first and then to recombine them. Because when we combine them consciously, it's better than when we just kind of are confused about everything and it's all meshed together by default. So there are two terms here, mudita and anumodana. Same root, mod or mud, the alternation of the u and o as vowels is very common for many languages, including Sanskrit. So mudita is exactly what we have just talked about, empathetic joy. It is the joy about the experiences of happiness that beings have right now. So the happiness, it is joy about happiness that has arisen as a result of causes and conditions. So practically speaking, what does that look like in meditation? I'm sitting here, I've relaxed my body, speech, and mind, maybe recited some prayers, maybe not, but I'm sitting here, I'm focused, I'm relaxed, and then I focus my awareness on what? On, let's say, the delight that my friend Anna here is experiencing from the fan behind her back. Maybe every time the fan moves behind her back, it's giving her bliss, physical bliss. I'm no longer dying for these 3 seconds. Then it moves away. So there is some physical pleasure that she might be experiencing. Let's say I assume that she does, or I see in her face that she's delighted. And then I focus my awareness on that and maybe on the different glimpses of joy that I see throughout the room. And then on the idea that this friend of mine today will be seeing his friends, and this friend of mine today will be seeing his partner, and this friend of mine is eating a watermelon somewhere right now. And it just, all these joyful experiences that are already happening for them. Or have happened in the past, or I know validly will happen in the future. Good nature joy, all the experiences of good nature joy. Good natured here is important because what's important in these practices is not to direct them towards the bad nature joy, for example, Schadenfreude, or delighting in the misery of others, let alone the joy about killing someone, and killing beings or stealing and so forth. Because some beings do experience those. The delight of having successfully robbed many people. The delight of having killed multiple beings, or committed genocide. There are forms of joy that people experience, but mudita wants nothing to do with those, or it should not be directed towards those. It is only directed consciously by us towards all the good nature joy. And good nature joy can be relatively kind of ethically neutral as, yes, the joy of having good watermelon. Well, there's some delight there. But it can also be directed towards the deepest experiences of spiritual bliss that beings have. Because there are great meditators in the world who are right now abiding in that joy of being free, or the bliss of accessing their deepest awareness and so forth. So all of that can be encompassed by mudita in the long run. So happiness as a result is what mudita is focused on. What does its companion anumodana focus on? It takes delight in the virtuous actions and qualities of others. So it delights in the causes of future happiness. From a karmic point of view, right? Because in Buddhism, karma is an important thing, obviously. And within that karmic theory, good actions, virtuous actions, bring good results. So the joy of enjoying watermelon, even that is a ripening from a Buddhist point of view of a positive karmic seed, a positive karmic compulsion that leads you then one day to a place in which you are sitting in front of a fan, or in which you are eating a watermelon, or you are having that divine cupcake, or you are having enlightenment. All comes from those compulsion seeds that are established through our intentions. So the positive acts that establish positive compulsions, actions conjoined in terms of the motivation with compassion, wisdom, love, empathetic joy, and all these other virtuous mental states, faith, and there's a list of others, some others. Those virtuous actions are what we delight in when we're practicing rejoicing or anumodana. So in Tibetan, these words are very different actually, because for rejoicing is jesuirang, and for mudita it's gawa. So even if you don't speak any Tibetan, obviously they don't sound like each other at all. Jesuirang, gawa doesn't sound much. So two different acts actually, and they're presented in different contexts. Mudita is presented in the teachings of the Four Immeasurables. Rejoicing is presented in the teachings of the 7-branch practice or 7-branch prayer. Two very different contexts. But once again, because they're so closely connected to each other, the cause of happiness and the result of happiness. When guiding meditations, some teachers, including some of my own teachers, bring them together to make the practice extra powerful. And we absolutely are allowed to do that. And we're also absolutely allowed to tease those apart and do those as two separate practices. So in our practice meetings, next time and the time after that, we will experiment with both. So feel free to join, dropping hints here and there. But while all of that is happening, these are two elements of it that are originally were described as separate. So in Anuruddha's description, which I just read out, mudita, or appreciative joy, has the characteristic of gladness at the success of others. He was not talking about virtuous qualities or actions of others, just talked about their success. And success here means that they successfully attained that divine cupcake, or that divine enlightenment, or anything else in between. They were successfully promoted, they did happily get married, whatever. There are multiple forms of joyful experiences, worldly and transworldly there. He was not talking about rejoicing in the fact that they've done something incredibly beautiful, they've done acts of generosity and so forth. But in the Tibetan tradition, anumodana acquires a great importance, and that's where we can bring them together. Actually, with regards to this anumodana, this rejoicing, there are many cultural elements that exist within both the Pali branch of Buddhism and in the Tibetan branch as well, for how to do that on a daily level. There are verbal formulas that are used to express that delight and to therefore trigger it within our own mind. So for example, in the Pali countries that rely on the Pali Canon and Pali teachings, you would have, let's say, a monastic sermon or something of that nature happening, and then at the end of it, the lay people or everyone together would recite sadhu, 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 which means excellent, 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 or how divine, how divine, how divine. So imagine if we were, every time we witness an act of virtue, an act of something meaningful, putting our hands together and saying, oh, how wonderful, and truly allowing ourselves to feel that, to wash that, allowing ourselves to wash that feeling of delight, to allow that feeling of delight to wash over us. That would establish very positive seeds there, potentially triggering also the experience of awe, which is another well-researched now in positive psychology mental state that is very crucial for our mental well-being and for our physical health, actually, and many other things. So a combination of awe and delight would be triggered by saying sadhu, 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 or in the Tibetan tradition, lekso, 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 how excellent, how excellent, how excellent, 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 excellent. So this is a simple practice that we can adopt ourselves without, doing it on the outer level, because maybe people will be confused. Why are you folding your hands and praying to me all of a sudden? All I did was serve you fries. Internally, there can be that element, oh, how delightful, how kind, and allowing that to feel. That's anumodanam, rejoicing. Beautiful quality to have. Next slide, please. Kind of for both of them, they have the same near enemy and far enemy. So just like loving kindness and just like compassion, and then later on equanimity, when we meditate on empathetic joy, potentially with an element of rejoicing there, and also when we're practicing rejoicing as well, we are gradually teaching our mind to walk away from these two other mental states that are not rejoicing. One is the direct opposite. The direct opposite of empathetic joy, let's say, is it sometimes, yes, it's the second line. Is it sometimes said lack of joy, which in particular manifests as envy and jealousy. So let's say that a frenemy of mine, friendly enemy of mine, gets promoted, and I do not get promoted for whatever reason. And then I'm not particularly thrilled, I might put on a good face if I'm polite enough, and yet there's no inner experience of joy, and then if I allow it to fester long enough, that lack of joy will probably manifest as envy and as jealousy. And envy, simply put, is a sense of discomfort or a sense of aversion towards the success of others. So the direct opposite. Instead of being glad about the success of others, I'm feeling aversion towards the success of others. And if I get truly envious and jealous and might take some action. I'll write an anonymous letter saying how horrible that person is and they should not be burned. People do insane things out of envy, and especially out of romantic jealousy, obviously, which is kind of a variation on the same theme. But unimaginable acts of violence and nastiness get committed out of those, but including a lot of the trash that we talk about each other online. You open a comment section under any celebrity's whatever, photograph of their lunch, a photograph of their leg, a photograph of their face. And there would be, of course, fans salivating, and then there would be haters. Well, why do they hate? I don't know. Why are they so obsessed? Why are you so obsessed with me, as they say? Why are they so obsessed, I don't know, with Beyonce or whatever? What's the focus? If you're not interested, just walk away. But that element of envy holds us hooked onto the object of our aversion very powerfully. So we cannot walk away. Our attention is linked to that object, but it is linked with a negative side to it, negative aspect to it. And envy and jealousy can be some of the most painful experiences that we actually have. And socially, they can be some of the most disruptive mental states to have because they truly motivate us to do a lot of nasty stuff. So to avoid those, or rather to transform those, we cultivate the opposite mental state of mudita, of empathetic joy. And it's said, very logically, the stronger the habit of empathetic joy becomes, the weaker the habit of envy will be. So that in each given situation, there will be higher chances of mudita arising and lower chances of envy arising. Very good. So mudita can be used as an antidote in the moment when we start feeling envy. We can use it as a conscious antidote. So let's say that friend did get promoted. We can, when we notice that we're envious, hold that envy in awareness for a little while, not acting upon it, of course, but just holding it in awareness, allowing it to kind of calm down a little bit. And then once there is a certain element of calmness there, a sort of neutrality already, then we can powerfully meditate on empathetic joy for that specific thing, and then extend it into empathetic joy for all beings with all their good-natured joys, including all the good-natured joys that we ourselves have, because that's another powerful element there. Empathetic joy directed towards ourselves satiates our inner hunger. So when we're not anymore such a hungry vampire, we're less likely to be envious. We're envious mostly because there is that nagging sense of inner emptiness that we're trying to feel with all those things. But when that gets filled with the glory of mudita and anumadana, especially if they're brought together, then there's a release. There's less neediness there. And by extension, envy gets dropped, abandoned, and mudita gets adopted. So that's the opposite. And then the near enemy is the false facsimile of empathetic joy, false facsimile of taking delight, gladness. So what is it described as? Pleasure in distraction is one way of translating it. And here in Anuruddha's text, Bhikkhu Bodhi translates that simply as merriment. But that's also kind of confusing. What does merriment mean? Does that mean I'm like, because to me, I'm a non-native English speaker, as you have noticed. And merriment to me means that I'm going to like a village fair and I'm drinking a pint. I don't know, that's kind of the associations that I get. So that's not the opposite of mudita. That's not the false facsimile of mudita. But when it's explained, what it means is frivolous joy that ignores reality. One way of arriving at that is focusing on the good-natured joys of beings to such a degree that all we see is rainbows and unicorns. It's like there's no problems in the world. Everyone is just being kind and nice and it's all good. And then someone says, no, social injustice, racism, misogyny, hello, like environmental destruction. We have -3 years to save, all of that. And we're like, no, empathetic joy, But that's not the point. That was not the point. It was never the point, but we kind of slipped into this false facsimile of it. And another type of this frivolous joy is simply focusing so much on the good-natured joys of others, than them having their vegan fish and chips, that we start only focusing on the hedonic side of things. And we ignore the fact that, yes, they are enjoying vegan fish and chips, but they're not yet enlightened. Hello. So let's kind of aspire towards that greater good in the long run. And we're all fish and chips right now. We're all focused on that. So modulating our mind out of that frivolous merriment, frivolous joy, into the joy that is truly empathetic but is also wise, imbued with wisdom, is the way we go about this practice. So one way to modulate it correctly is to be on the lookout for this frivolous joy, or this kind of stupid joy, let's call it that way, or naive joy, and modulating into the wise type of joy. That's one way of doing it. Another way to accomplish the same goal is to use a combination of all the four immeasurables, because they work in a synergetic system in which each of the immeasurables allows us to balance the others. So it is said then when we overdo it with empathetic joy and we kind of arrive at that naive joy instead of the actual thing, we're invited to practice loving kindness, because loving kindness sees that much greater happiness is still possible and is not yet attained. And then in the same manner, and then we will actually talk about that in the equanimity session next month, after we've completed joy meditations, because that will be kind of us wrapping up the whole system of the four immeasurables. But then in a similar manner, joy itself is used as an antidote for sorrow when we overdo it with compassion, but we kind of go awry and we arrive at sorrow instead of compassion proper. Compassion is used as an antidote for clinging attachment, which is the false facsimile for loving kindness, in which, there's actually two systems, or maybe even three systems of teachings that. And the antidote for this clinging attachment is equanimity. And then compassion is used as kind of a fixing for equanimity, which slips into indifference. But there are actually other systems of presenting it. And even Jigme and another master that we're going to quote from now, like Chenpa, they present two different approaches. But basically, it's kind of a circle, whichever way you put it. And there's one immeasurable balances the preceding one, and they're kind of in a loop. Next slide, please. So with empathetic joy, there's a very interesting sequence there, very different from how loving kindness is cultivated in compassion and equanimity, actually. So to generate empathetic joy, we need a joy buddy. We need to choose a being that we know of, at least. We don't need for them to know us. Let's put it that way. They don't need to be aware of our existence. We need to know that they exist, and ideally that we be alive. And they need to be a jovial being. They need to be they need to have a super sunny disposition. They need to be a being who's truly joyful and laughing a lot and, perseveres through difficulties and has a light heart. And there are people sometimes like that in our immediate family, and sometimes in the global arena. So you can choose someone personally close to you. You can choose a spiritual master like that. There are many spiritual masters that are like that. I've met many of them myself, including, of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's lived through 70 years of genocide and exile and all the trials and tribulations and whatnot. Every day something, being thrown at him by the CCP. But, CPC, whatever it's called, Communist Party of China, yeah, CPC. Chinese Communist Party, CCP, yeah, something else, something new rising every day, and yet, absolute lightness of being, joy that is there. But, we need to choose someone that makes sense for us to serve as that person. And we will imagine them, that's what we're going to do now. We will imagine them, we will take the light in their lightness of being, and then we will reorient it towards ourselves. And then eventually, after we have done these first two steps of this jovial being in ourselves, we can then extend it to all the friends, all the strangers, and all the enemies, and then all beings, in the same way that we did with loving kindness. So let's just do this as a very brief practice, just 5 minutes, which is enough to practice some empathetic joy. releasing our breath so that it can move freely. Relaxing our facial muscles so that this sense of relaxation can start spreading out towards all the other parts of our body. Briefly revisiting our positive motivation for being here, our highest goals and aspirations. And then, with our body resting like that, with our motivation established in this manner, bringing to mind this jovial person that comes to mind as a source of joy and gladness. Someone who is truly lighthearted, truly optimistic, truly resilient in the most joyful way possible. Imagining them in the space in front of us and allowing our attention, our awareness to discern the sparks of joy in their being. To truly be jovial, they would have an ability to enjoy hedonic pleasures, but also they would have the inner joy stemming from the depths of their mind, for their positive qualities, from their true nature. And as we are attending to these sparks of joy and the multiple forms of joy in their being, we're taking delight in that, which can be accomplished by thinking, how wonderful, or how amazing. Or by establishing that gladness directly. But for many of us, a verbal cue might be of help. And if that gladness is not coming up naturally, we need to pretend it's there like a good actor and to induce it. And first it might be weak and artificial, but it's all about training. So feeling and thinking, how wonderful that they do have this gladness, this lightness of being. May their joy grow, adding this tiny element of aspiration. And then turning this light of our awareness back towards ourselves, towards our being, and seeing our own inner joy. The sparks of joy that we ourselves have by even this joy that we just generated, but also our pleasant hedonic experiences and the inner joy that we possess deep within us, stemming from within. Holding our awareness on all these sparks and combinations and displays of joy and generating the same gladness of how wonderful. May this joy grow. Nourishing these sparks of joy, even with our breath if we want, as if we were breathing life into them to activate them more strongly. And then for a little while, opening up our awareness to think that many beings in this world, if not all beings, possess some sparks of joy somewhere. Small joys of a pleasant breeze, or nice cup of tea, or some sunlight. Deep joys associated with our deepest nature. Many sparks there. How wonderful. May this joy grow. And then releasing the aspiration, the contrived gladness, to simply rest in the afterglow of that in a spacious type of awareness without a reference point. Then coming back to the body to reactivate its muscles by moving the fingers, rocking back and forth, smiling if we wish to. And then slowly concluding the meditation and arriving at our shared space. Thank you. Next slide, please. So there's a lot that could be said, a lot more that could be said, and we will hopefully say it in the subsequent sessions, which will be primarily meditation, which with just a tiny bit of explanations here and there. That's how this course is basically organized. The first session of each month is a more elaborate conceptual presentation with some meditation, and then it's mostly meditation with a little bit of explanations in between specific sits. So if you can, or if you want to join on Zoom or come here physically, I would be very joyful, pun intended for me. But one more thing that I do want to definitely quote from the great master Lobsang Tenpa, great master of the Dzogchen tradition, who has also influenced pretty much all the other traditions, including the Gelug tradition, from his presentation of the Four Immeasurables, which is once again, in a way, one of the most brilliant ones that exist in Tibetan literature. So he says this about joy, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama very frequently quotes from Lobsang Tenpa and has commentaries on his teachings that are published. So this is what he says here. Lobsang Tenpa, the object of your focus will be beings who are happy. The form your attitude will take will be to think, what joy! These beings have no need of me to bring them to the state of happiness, for best of all they found it for themselves. From this day till they gain enlightenment, may they never lose their joy and comfort. So exactly what we have discussed. Gladness plus this wish of may they not lose this, or may their joy grow. I kind of have a personal preference for may the joy grow over may they not lose it, because it's not simply about not losing it in a way. And I'm not in any way arguing with Lobsang Tenpa. He's looking at it from a more profound type of perception in terms of beings actually not being separate from joy at any time because their deepest nature is joy itself. That's the philosophical position that he espouses generally and teaches very, very clearly in his brilliant texts and oral instructions. But for us, when we read this specific verse outside of its original context, it might seem like he's inviting us to wish for beings to not be separated from that joy of fish and chips, which is not kind of the totality of it. So that's why I prefer the may the joy grow element. And the next one, please. And then in another part of the same presentation, so this is my next one. It's just the Dalai Lama and Venerable Children commenting on that. But then this one is him describing the benefits of empathetic joy practice, and that's just kind of to get us more enthusiastic about actually applying it. The following: the sign of your proficiency will be that being joyful, you will have no envious jealousy. Later, when you concentrate on joy, you will be free of all conceptual reference. Naturally, you will be at peace with bliss in body, speech, and mind. As fruit, you will have joy and steady wealth. Okay. So some of the, first of all, empathetic joy in this presentation of the Four Immeasurables, in all the presentations of the Four Immeasurables, all Four Immeasurables bring the same types of benefit with regards to the so-called 11 benefits, and we have talked about them at the end of the compassion session. So the whole list of your face will be serene, you will sleep well, your dreams will be good, you will be waking up easily, you will be delightful to other beings, including animals and gods, you will not be harmed by fire, blah, 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 blah. All of that is equally applicable to loving kindness and compassion and empathetic joy and equanimity, especially the first three for a specific reason. But, and they're also all equally useful as concentration practices. But here Lobsang Tenpa, and he's not the only master to say so, says that because joy is joyful, because joy is bliss, is delight, is ecstasy, is rapture, it is especially easy to use as a concentration practice. Although, anthropologically speaking, this is the most neglected of the Four Immeasurables. Especially across the traditions. You will find, if you take a look across the world, yogis who are focused on loving kindness as their main practice. You will find no shortage of loving kindness retreats. We just did one in August in Wales, but there are annual loving kindness retreats run by someone in this world. So you will find those. You will find retreats on compassion as well, and you will find, especially in the Tibetan tradition, yogis of compassion, yoginis of compassion, people who focus on compassion as their primary practice. And then everything else gets woven into that. Equanimity is often presented as the foundation for the other immeasurables, so it receives a lot of attention as well. And in this day and age, it becomes quite important for overcoming bias. For example, in hospital settings, professional settings, and racial settings, to overcome misogyny and so forth. We do need to be equanimous to not be biased. But joy kind of, because of the other three receiving so much attention, joy kind of gets neglected, which is the historical tragedy in a way, both because it has so many benefits and so much happiness that it can bring to us in the moment when we're practicing it, but also because the actual goal of this practice is for us to overcome our negativity bias, to overcome our evolutionary, well, not overcome, but to balance our evolutionary tendency to constantly be on the lookout for bad things, because that's how we survived as a species. We survive as a species by constantly registering dangers and dealing with them ahead of time. However, what tends to happen is that we go, because of all sorts of things associated with our neurophysiology and trauma and many other things, we go into overdrive on that. And so we slip into what Buddhists would describe as sorrow, the opposite, the false facsimile of compassion. So the whole world gets seen by us as nothing but darkness, nothing but rape and murder and war and corruption and the destruction of the Amazonian forests and so forth. And this is where we need to use empathetic joy and say, yes, there were children harmed today, but 20 million mothers did take care of their children with love and wisdom. There was environmental destruction today, but so many people are standing up for what's right. There was this bad thing happening in my life, but I didn't enjoy that watermelon and that cupcake. And even those tiny shifts, counting our blessings, as it's sometimes called in the Christian tradition, make a huge difference for our ability to quite literally not kill ourselves, but then giving us energy and strength and power to continue doing the good work, including the good work of cultivating the four immeasurables and applying them in practice. And the last line, so before that, when we are practicing empathetic joy as a concentration technique, it will fill our energetic field, our body and mind complex, with a lot of bliss. So that's what Lobsang Tenpa is saying. And then when we do that, it becomes actually even easier to concentrate. But the more we concentrate, the more bliss we experience. So it's, once again, a self-reinforcing practice, and that it's kind of a shame that it's, in a way, neglected. And not many people use it as their primary concentration or shamatha technique, but it can be used that way. That's what he's talking about. But then the last line is especially flirtatious, I think, kind of cute. As fruit you will have joy, oh, duh, and steady wealth. Well, that one is interesting. Well, why will I have steady wealth? Well, that is one major reason for why anumadana, or rejoicing, is encouraged so much. It says that when we rejoice in someone's virtuous qualities, we receive a replica of those karmic seeds within our mental stream. So when we're practicing mudita, a very similar thing happens. And when we're practicing mudita and anumadana in union, we're receiving lots of positive potential within our mind. And then that ripens as us having abundance, prosperity, good luck, good fortune, and also the fuel to fuel our path towards awakening. So sometimes in the Buddhist tradition, when people ask, what do I need to do to receive wealth? Because Buddhism, like any other religious tradition, has its own magic, mantras and rituals and things like that. And the primary suggestion there is practice generosity, because that's the karmic cause of being wealthy. And then there are specific visualization practices and so forth to potentially affect the interdependence of things. But one thing that often gets omitted, and that is here described by Lobsang Tenpa, is quite powerful, is to also practice lots of empathetic joy. Because even if it does not bring us immediately out of wealth, well, yes, things don't happen that fast. Our inner wealth of joy and kindness and being non-envious will be immense. And I think that's quite motivating to, at least for me, to continue practicing with this. So on that note, that's a little bit of advertising for empathetic joy. I would wish you a beautiful day, but also to invite those of you who felt somewhat inspired by this presentation to keep coming back. We have 3 more sessions to practice all of this material. And then we have our resource page with all the recordings and so forth that you will be able to continue practicing with for as long as you want. So ahead of time, I'm feeling joy about all the vegan fish and chips that you're going to have today and all the good cupcakes and watermelons, but also about the spiritual delights that await you today and in the future. And thank you so much for joining. So I'm going to bring those back to reception in case someone wants to buy these. Thank you.
Thank you.